So let's go to the second speaker. Sven Reichardt is a distinguished professor of contemporary history at the University of Constance. He has published widely on the history of fascism, the history of war, civil war and terrorism, and on social movements and civil societies. In late 20th century, he has several international awards and fellowship. In summer 2025, he will be a senior fellow at the International Research Center for Cultural Studies in Vienna. Please, Sven.
Thanks for having me here at the conference. I hope you can hear me well. As most of you might know, I have a cold and I've lost 50% of my voice, but I think it's working. So, Annette Becker's essay highlights significant developments that have not been sufficiently acknowledged in many overviews of the Great War, and we have, of course, a lot of overviews on the Great War. This includes, for instance, the status of the enemy aliens during the First World War, which Daniela Cagliotti has examined in her numerous studies on war and citizenship from a comparative European perspective, understanding the interwar period as part of the century of refugees and the century of internment in camps or even genocides is an insight that has not gained enough traction within our historical scholarship and in our overviews on the interwar period. Becker also addresses the controversy, at least in the written version of her paper, surrounding the brutalization of European societies, particularly the German society following the First World War. Recent research has significantly qualified George Mosse's thesis on this matter. Richard Bessel has shown in his 1993 book, very early on, that the majority of the German war veterans were peaceful and by no means fascist desperados. Der Reichsbund der Kriegsbeschädigten, Kriegsteilnehmer und Kriegshinterbliebenen, which had some 830,000 members in 1922, was peaceful and social democratic in origin, campaigning for better pensions for war-disabled, war orphans and war widows. The older interpretation of the failed return from a war to civilian and private life applied more to officers than to ordinary frontline soldiers. Many veterans organizations acted as international and pacifist groups in civil society in Germany, but also in Italy, France, and other European countries. The German Nazis did not try to recruit war veterans until their regime was in power, especially in the mid and late 1930s. And let us not forget that the fascist street fighters in Germany and even in Italy were too young to have taken an active part as a soldier in war. Even in Italy, although it was established, the squadristi from 1919 to 22, very close to the First World War. It was not only war that leads to brutalization, and brutalization has happened, as you have shown, but how states and societies engaged with the reintegration of the soldiers, as Robert Gerwart has shown in his comparative studies. Defeat, imperial collapse, and revolutionary turmoil after the war were important causes for political radicalization. Changes in the image of masculinity, in which war injured and traumatized men no longer represent the type of the male hero, and women began to emancipate themselves on the labor market, radicalized, let's say, nationalist, conservative young men who could not find work and exchanged the ideal of the family provider for that of the determined street fighter. I will limit myself to 3 remarks regarding this compelling paper by Annette Becker. First, I am built upon Becker's thesis and addressing the war ethics of the Nazis and Italian fascists. I will do so. In doing so, I will not only focus on ideology, but also on the organizational and paramilitary practices of fascism. fascism is present in your paper, but not that prominent as it could be. Secondly, I will reflect on the connections between the wars in the 19th and 20th century. I will summarize how Nazi perceived the Second World War against the backdrop of their experiences in the First World War. Additionally, I will discuss the thesis linking the Holocaust to the colonial wars of the 19th century. And finally, my third point, I wish to engage with the concept of genocide and contrast it with the notion of fascist warfare in order to evaluate the analytical advantages and disadvantages of both terms. So to begin with, let us consider the martial ethics that Becker has so impressively described. The ideology and ethics she outlined corresponded to a murderous practice. My sketch is what fascists do best is killing. And Michael Mann has highlighted in this sense the centrality of paramilitarism into fascist movements. Quote, paramilitarism was both a key value and a key organizational form of fascism. It was seen as popular, dwelling up spontaneously from below, but was also elitist, supposedly representing the vanguard of the nation, so a new alternative elite then. What essentially distinguishes fascists from the many military and monarchical dictatorships of the world is this bottom-up and violent quality of its paramilitarism. Paramilitarism was violence, but it was always a great deal more than violence because it aimed at winning the support or respect by bystanders. As we all know, fascist movements were dominated by its paramilitary component, and nearly, in Germany, 430,000 of the roughly 850,000 Nazis in 1933 were stormtroopers, so half of them, and nearly a third of the 322,000 members of the Italian Fascist Party in May 22 were squadristi. In a similar situation, as we all know, applied in other European fascist countries, especially in Eastern European countries. Think about Romanian Legion or the Iron Guard, many others. Hungary would be another example. The paramilitary character of fascist movements was shaped by three key elements. First, continuous violent propaganda behavior. Second, the image of the uncompromising, decisive, masculine street fighter. And third, the presentation of paramilitary groups as mass organizations. The bottom-up quality of fascist paramilitarism proved an attractive proposition for traditional conservative elites who otherwise struggled to gain this mass support. So fascist paramilitaries marched in public, were equipped with weapons, made use of a hierarchy that was semi-disciplined. Their organizational structures were characterized by strong group mentality based on male comradeship and the primacy of small groups. Their activities were time-consuming, emotionally exhilarating, and liable to consume the life of each member. Discipline and disobedience to leaders were achieved through a sense of brotherhood generated by the commitment of members on a horizontal level and through voluntary recruitment. Paramilitary communities represent a new form of political life, a new form of organization which has established after the First World War. Through its emotional bonds, these charismatic leaders, these violence-oriented notions of honor, calculated violations of rules and laws, and reference to the superior legitimacy of their own goals, maybe nationalist values, as we have heard, and others. Violence is a crucial element in building its cohesion. Wolfgang Wysowski has explained the reinforcing effect of violence on the community with the conceptualization of the mob. By mob, he refers to the dynamic group of young men in which the most faint-hearted, as he puts it, is suddenly allowed to do everything. Moreover, paramilitarism was a constant radicalizing factor, not only in fascist movement, but also in fascist regimes. Fascist states do not only rely on institutionalized or even bureaucratized forms of political decision-making. This is not a barbarian state we are talking about. Instead, they instrumentalize more or less spontaneous threats of violence as a dynamic element in its radicalization. Fascist paramilitarism existed alongside the state and offered extra legal forms of, as I put it, participatory violence. I'm sorry. Next to bureaucratic structures, legal systems, and controlled coercive apparatuses are militias committing violence. Indeed, paramilitary violence, thank you, renouncing any form of consideration of negotiation or orderly procedures. And this was, this is my point, an integral and central part of every fascist state. This paramilitarism was beyond any direct biographical relation to the First World War. In fascism, violence was an end in itself. Comradeship and control, the cult of youth, death obsession, male camaraderie, and radical nationalism were key characteristics of the movements, although these members were not part of the soldiers of the First World War. So it's not a direct experience of what they have experienced in the First World War, because they were too young to participate in the war. Paramilitary military organizations simultaneously fragmented and radicalized the fascist states, experiencing excitement, proving toughness, breaking everyday routines, and exercising power were crucial activities among these paramilitary groups, who turned government ministries against one another and deepened the informal patronage networks, or the network structure of the fascist states and the paramilitaries running through fascist state bureaucracies. One example would be the razzia, only one example of this more or less spontaneous politics of violence. This leads me to my second point, the contextualization of the First World War. To begin with, it can be argued that National Socialism was a product of the defeat of the war, and the National Socialists viewed the First World War as a teacher for the Second World War. For them, the treaties of Versailles initially provided a societal basis of legitimacy for the uncompromising focus on war. At the same time, they concluded that a population would need to be hardened and toughened for a second war. Self-denial, decisiveness replaced the liberal urban consumer society, alongside the rejection of parliament, democracy, public discourse, political parties. The impending war necessitated unified and strong leadership capable of eradicating Marxism, Bolshevism, class conflict from domestic politics. More significant were the military lessons. In their initial planning, the National Socialists thought to avoid another two-front war, aiming to counterbalance the West's material superiority through superior German military strategy and a technological focus. Furthermore, they emphasized the necessity of fostering a militant spirit among the youth who were to be fanatically educated. Improving military training and enforcing discipline through structured courses represented the organizational forms for these aims. Regarding Eastern Europe, the incorporation of local economies and occupied territories into the German war economy was planned from the outset, as was the immediate integration of Austria, the Sudetenland, and Czechoslovakia. This strategy entailed ruthless treatment of civilians, including the starvation of the Soviet population, to compensate it for the anticipated food shortages, within the German Reich. As you all know, this was the main problem of the First World War, this hunger and food shortages. Additional lessons derived from the First World War included the development of substitute materials, the intensification of agricultural production, and the mobilization of prisoners of war and forced laborers. The search for Lebensraum, living space, was directed eastward rather than toward colonies, with corresponding large-scale spatial plans, Großraumplanung, developed early on. In this context, the displacement, exclusion, and extermination of the Jewish population were also envisaged. In Hitler's and the National Socialist delusional worldview, Jews were held responsible, as we all know, for virtually everything: urbanization, Western civilization, financial capitalism, universalism, communism, whatever you mean. In the modern world, more or less. In its settlement planning, the occupied territory in Oberost, and this is quite interesting as far as the First World War is concerned, the territory in Oberost played a greater role than the classical settlement colonialism in German Southwest Africa or East Africa. The territory of the Oberbefehlshaber Ost, the Supreme Commander East, was administered as a German-occupied area on the Eastern Front of the First World War by General Staff of the Supreme Commander East from November 15 to July 18. The military administration pursued a threefold strategy with the framework of Germany's border state policy. First, the region was to be subjected to German rules and order. Subsequently, Ludendorff planned to exploit the land and the population through forced labor, something we know from the Second World War. And third, and the final phase, envisioned the appropriation and resettlement of the area according to the plan by Erich Keup. Konrad Meyer's Generalplan Ost, 5 minutes, good, from May 42, with its proposals for the resettlement of the ethnic Germans and the displacement, enslavement, and extermination of people classified as Jewish, bears significant resemblances to this precursor. The comprehensive monstrousness of these plans leads me to think less of the logic of the 19th century settlement colonialism than of this wartime developed occupation regime. Nonetheless, the Generalplan Ost shares with colonialism the ideas of unstrained exploitation of conquered territories, the imposition of pervasive racial hierarchies, ethnic cleansing, and reorganization of occupied areas, and the establishment of settlement hubs featuring fortified villages. The principle of destroying to replace, as Patrick Wolff once described settler colonialism, was not only developed, but much more swiftly and systematically in this Oberost region, and this far-reaching societal implications of the experiment in the First World War distinguishes it from those of the 19th century. The First World War as a total war that mobilized all societal resources served as a more significant precursor to the Second World War than the colonial wars of the 19th century. Undoubtedly, even during the colonial wars of the 1880s and beyond, the distinction between soldier and civilian had already been abandoned. Civilian populations were often indiscriminately declared fair game in colonial campaigns, treated as an integral part of a broader, inherently hostile population. Practices such as crop burning, cattle riding, and widespread devastation were commonplace, as we all know. But unlike the First and the Second World Wars, colonial wars were never characterized by the comprehensive mobilization of all societal resources, whether in terms of personnel nor material. The degree, this is my argument, of internal mobilization in this conflict never reached the levels observed during the world wars. In the colonies, daily life was marked by ongoing low-level violence, rendering the concept of total mobilization largely irrelevant. And in conclusion, my very last point, I would like to make a final remark on the term genocide. I will be very short. I try to be very short here. In this context, I consider the analysis of the radicalization and totalization of warfare, as I have already shown, more promising than the perspective of the concept of genocide. As we all know, the problem of the concept of genocide is focusing on intention. The definition of a group is very vague. The intent to destroy is very hard to find, and as we all know, it is a normative concept, and we have to deal with a normative concept for analytical purposes. Fascist wars, as I would say, or fascist warfare, converged a civilizing mission and the desire for destruction. Alan Kramer has shown recently that fascist warfare of the Nazis and the Italian and Spanish fascists, as well as the Japanese army, quote, merged total war with civil war by, quote, annihilation as a feasible and desirable intention of warfare, racial population displacement, and ethnic cleansing of entire population groups. End of quote. The fascist warfare developed not least through mutual observation. This is my very last remark. The empires observed the wars, the fascist wars of the fascist brother nations, already in the years from 35 to 38 with care, and sought to derive lessons from one another. They learned about the importance of rapid mobile war with broad aerial bombardments, tank offensive, eminent importance of ideological training for soldiers, the poor treatment of civilian population and the prisoners of war. The chain of massacres on the civilian population was understood not only as a necessary measures to maintain respect, but also as a goal in itself. Counterinsurgents violence was part of the murderous policies of fascist regimes, modeled as ruthless fighting spirit, as an ethnic of decisiveness and racial purity. The mutual entanglement of the fascist movement and regimes, their exchange relationships, reinforces the importance of understanding fascism as a radicalizing process with consistent feedbacks between practices and ideas. The idea of fascism as a radicalized grand area imperialism, which connects destructive warfare with ethno-racial renewal, ethnic cleansing and settler colonialism, a system that connected economic plunder with modernizing spatial and economic planning. This, I think, helps us in our effort to compare different fascist regimes and answer the question Annette raised, at least in her coda in the written text, with her remarks on the relation between war and genocide. Thank you very much.